My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
Two princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, sharing their lives as equals, blissfully unaware of the decision their uncle would make that would set a new course for them both and change the entire shape of British history.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me.
Despite the enormously close bond they had in their formative years, the heir to the throne and her younger sister would face very difficult challenges which would come to define their relationship. The eldest sister would grow up to become the most powerful woman in the world and the titled leader of the British Empire. Her sister, Princess Margaret, would struggle to find meaning and purpose to her role, sometimes driving a wedge between the two sisters.
They were as different as chalk and cheese, Princess Elizabeth. Very uncomplicated, very straightforward. Princess Margaret, very complex. You know, her sister in later life described her as being an enigma. And really, that about sums her up because she was a very enigmatic personality.
Margaret had a magical charisma and a charm, lighting up the room and captivating those in her path. Yet Elizabeth's exceptional dedication and attitude to the duties she inherited as she followed in her father's footsteps would have the nation's unwavering respect and love, a love which Margaret would come to envy. They were both princesses, but only one could be queen. Scandal broke in British newspapers. King Edward VIII wanted to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson, but Parliament could find no way to allow it. At the time, the rules were very clear. The monarch is the head of the Church of England, and it was simply untenable that the king could marry a divorcee. It was against the law. Despite Sir Winston Churchill's intervention and attempts to change the law at that time, it was not acceptable to the British government, and King Edward was forced to abdicate the throne to be with the woman he loved.
When their uncle, David as he was known to the family, otherwise King Edward VIII, abdicated, it was Princess Elizabeth who told Princess Margaret, and she said, "Uncle David's going away and Papa is to be king." And Princess Margaret said to her, "Does that mean you're going to be queen?" And Elizabeth said, "Yes, one day." And nothing more was ever said about it or between them. And Princess Elizabeth, as we know very well, is able to compartmentalize aspects of her life. So she realized, this girl of 10, that one day she would become queen.
It came as a great shock to the royal household. Elizabeth and Margaret's father, King Edward's younger brother, Prince Albert, was to become King George VI.
His was the first voluntary abdication in 1,000 years of British history. An abdication he explained to his far-flung empire in the most dramatic and heart-rending farewell ever broadcast.
But you believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love.
On the 10th of December 1936, Prince Albert watched as his older brother signed the abdication notice. It was not only a day that would change the rest of his life, but he became distinctly aware of what this meant for his family. His two girls would soon feel the enormous pressure of the crown. It was his job to make sure Elizabeth was prepared for the task she would undertake when she eventually succeeded him, and to teach Margaret the importance of her support to Elizabeth.
Things did change for Princess Elizabeth as heiress presumptive, because it was felt that on an educational level that she needed higher education, particularly when you think of the British Constitution and matters like that, that it was now crucial that she should be very well aware of. And so she was given this additional instruction by the then Provost of Eton College, Sir Henry Martin. I talked to Princess Margaret about this on one occasion and said that you didn't get that higher education. And she said, no, it was always a bone of contention. And I said, well, it was really very short-sighted, because when you think that your grandfather, King George V, was the second son and he was called to the throne, your father was the second son, and the same thing happened with him. Here you were the second child. There was only a heartbeat between you and your sister, yet you did not get the same further education that Princess Elizabeth got. And she said it was always a bone of contention.
The Yorks became king and queen. Elizabeth, at 10, was now heir presumptive. Reviewing the girl guides at Windsor Castle, the little princesses Elizabeth, 12, and Margaret, 8, assumed new importance.
This would be the start of a significant transitional period in the two sisters' relationship. They had gone from being two equals to the heir presumptive and the spare. It had an enormous impact on the dynamic of their relationship, and this shift in power and status would move in Elizabeth's favour. King George asked Elizabeth to write a review of his coronation, to get her to take in all the thoughts and feelings she had about the event, as she would one day experience it for herself.
Next, His Majesty is to be presented with the Holy Bible. To enable him to receive it, the Lord Great Chamberlain draws off the jeweled glove, after which the Bible can be delivered.
Elizabeth's admiration for her papa was made quite clear as she described him as looking very beautiful in a crimson robe, and also how Westminster Abbey was covered with a sort of haze and wonder as papa was crowned.
From the coronation chair, His Majesty goes to the chair of state for his inthronization. For royal families, as for the rest of us, life has its times of sorrow as well as joy. With this royal family, the British peoples have shared both. To the King, who in his own words now enters upon a new life, and to his charming Queen, Britain and Empire wish many years of happiness. Long may they reign. God save the King.
At the time of their parents' coronation in May of 1937, white lace dresses had been designed for them, special gold coronets had been made for them, and also trains, the purple robes of their rank. And Margaret was a bit bothered by the fact that her train was shorter than her sister's, and she complained about this, and it had to be explained to her that it had nothing to do with rank. She wasn't being demoted in any way. What it meant was that the train was cut in relation to their height. So as Margaret was shorter, she obviously had a shorter train. So there was just that kind of little thing. Why doesn't that also apply to me? As she grew up, of course, she knew perfectly well why there would be those kind of certain differences.
Queen Elizabeth is one of the most well-known women in history. She is the longest reigning British monarch and head of the Commonwealth, encompassing over 50 countries. She has a real and substantial influence on the world, But before the abdication, she thought she would lead a relatively normal life.
Princess Elizabeth had a very, very happy childhood. She was born in 1926 in the centre of London, in Bruton Street, and it was 6 weeks before the general strike, so it was a time of great political turbulence. But there was still great excitement about this new royal baby, and people were really interested in the royal family, although they never thought that she would be, you know, an heir to the throne, because at the time everyone loved the Prince of Wales. Princess Margaret was born in 1930, and Elizabeth looked after her. She was always really kind to her little sister, a beautiful little sister, and they had a very, very close relationship. They looked after each other, but obviously Elizabeth was the oldest, and so she kind of took charge of her little sister. But they were dressed identically, which must have been quite difficult for Elizabeth, but that's how royal families dressed in those days.
Her younger sister, Princess Margaret, became her best friend and confidant as a child. They grew up in a relatively stable and mundane family dynamic. Their mother and father were very hands-on parents, and they spent a great deal of time together. It was a seemingly blissful life, with privilege, but very little in the way of the pressure they would later face.
King George VI, he always referred to himself, his wife and 2 daughters as us 4. And they were a royal family within the broader royal family. But because they never anticipated their ranks and their position and their responsibilities changing, they anticipated carrying on as being this very close-knit, very loving us 4, you know. So Princess Margaret and her sister did have hugely enjoyable and very loving childhood. When they were children, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, of course, they had, apparently Princess Margaret had a pretty good left hook. So, you know, and Princess Elizabeth would sometimes complain, Margaret always wants what I want. So I think, you know, what you actually see there between the 2 of them is sibling rivalry, you know, as there would be with other children, other sisters, other brothers. It's, you know, it's something that one always has to remember, is that essentially these, you know, they may have been princesses, they may have been royal, but they were also human. And, you know, and this was the tone of their lives, that they were very, very close. But of course there were kind of moments where they would kick and they would bite and they would fight, you know, or particularly Princess Margaret would.
Even at a young age, however, their differences were starting to show. Sir Winston Churchill described Elizabeth as a character. She has an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant. 4-year-old Elizabeth is said to have said, "I've got a baby sister, Margaret Rose, and I'm going to call her Bud." When asked why, she said, "Well, she's not a real rose yet, is she? She's only a bud." Little did she know how apt her comments were, and how her sister would later blossom into a beautiful woman.
Because there was this incredibly strong, loving bond between Princess Margaret and Princess Elizabeth, that there was always that support there throughout their lives. You know, they were as different as chalk and cheese, Princess Elizabeth, very uncomplicated, very straightforward. Princess Margaret, very complex. You know, her sister in later life described her as being an enigma. And really, that about sums her up, because she was a very enigmatic personality. I don't think Princess Margaret consciously lived her life thinking of the differences between her and her sister. It wouldn't have made any sense for her to have done so. But it has been said that she was jealous of her sister. Well, I always counter that by saying given how close they were always throughout their life. You know, even if it was just to say hello, they talk on the telephone every day. It's very difficult to maintain that close bond, as well as being jealous of somebody.
In 1940, Hitler began to bomb England. Thousands of children were evacuated, among them Elizabeth and Margaret, now 14 and 10, who were sent up the Thames to a safer haven.
Well, the outbreak of World War II affected the British royal family hugely because they were right up there at Buckingham Palace, which was a big target for the German bombers. But they decided that they would not leave the country, they would stay there with their people, and but they obviously had to look after their two daughters. Elizabeth and Margaret eventually stayed at Windsor Castle for 5 years, while the King and Queen went to London during the week, and they wanted to be visible to their people, so they would go round the bombed areas, you know, and meet the people. And obviously the King became very involved with the troops, and he would go and visit the troops. So they were a very big part of the sort of PR war effort.
What tragedies, what horrors, what crimes has Hitler and all that Hitler stands for brought upon Europe and the world?
Of the 500 German planes that came over that day, more than 1/3 were shot down.
In the 28 days of terror from September 7th to October 5th, the Nazis dropped 50 million pounds of bombs on the city, killed 7,000 helpless civilians, and wounded 10,000 more. Bombs fell on Buckingham Palace, Westminster Abbey, the Houses of Parliament, Fleet Street, the center of the news, St. Paul's Cathedral. Bombs blasting the historic past out of the lives of Englishmen.
The two sisters' favourite fun activities to entertain themselves and their family was to put on pantomimes, and it was here that Margaret discovered her ability to perform, and she began to shine. She took all the attention, and Elizabeth was pleased to stand back and let Margaret enjoy the spotlight.
Well, in October 1940, the King and Queen paid a visit to the BBC, and the chairman of the BBC asked them if there was any chance that perhaps his eldest daughter might contribute to the children, the evacuees, who were in Canada, Australia, North America. There were a lot of them there. And they had a program called Children's Hour, which was embryonic then. And they asked the King if he would consider allowing his daughter to do it. Well, of course, she was thrilled to do it and practiced very, very hard. And eventually, aged only 14, gave this extremely professional speech to the children that were separated from their parents.
5 famous little hearts are stirred as the Dion Quince listened to a broadcast from London by Princess Elizabeth, a message of cheer to children of the Empire.
My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night, children. Good night, and good luck to you all.
Because Princess Elizabeth, always thinking about her younger sister, she brought her younger sister in at the very end and said, "Come on, Margaret." And "Come on, Margaret" became a catchphrase in America. The speech went down an absolute storm in America. And it was like headline news in the New York Post, you know, that this princess had given this speech to the evacuees. So, and also politically, it was a very good thing because, of course, Churchill was trying to get the president, Roosevelt, you know, to enter into the war you know, to support us. So anything that we could do was a good thing.
The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
It was a difficult few years for Britons and the two princesses, but they kept each other company and enjoyed their time in Windsor Castle. Like many other British children, they spent a lot of time apart from their parents. Elizabeth and Margaret were true wartime children, and growing up in a time of austerity, even as princesses, would impact them for a long time to come. They took part in the government's Dig for Victory campaign, growing their own vegetables to help fight the food shortages.
Princess in overalls. On her 19th birthday, the heiress presumptive to England's throne learns a few facts about tires and carburetors. Elizabeth is in the ATS, or British WAC, and at the King's request, is being treated just like any other trainee. Now, visited by her parents and sister Margaret Rose at a training station in southern England, she shows them she knows a fan belt from a spark plug all right and isn't afraid to get her hands dirty. Her father gave her an officer's commission early in March. Papa and Mama seem to approve, too. Daughter is the first woman member of the royal family to join the services full time. The young princess, who's never set foot in a London bus and was only once in the subway, now drives a truck for the Red Cross. And, come to think of it, can you name a better way for a princess to spend her birthday?
Her father's trust and belief in Elizabeth became quite clear, as when he went to tour the Italian battlefields during the war, he named her as a Councillor of State, which meant she could represent the UK when he was away or unable to do so. Elizabeth is the last surviving head of state to have served in World War II. Princess Margaret, being a few years younger than Elizabeth, became a Girl Guide and later joined the Sea Rangers.
Princess Elizabeth and Margaret Rose are successful contestants in this horse show near London, while war rages a few miles away. Once again, the horse is king for a day, and even their majesties look on.
I think that living 5 years of your childhood somewhere would give you either a loathing or a deep affection for a place, and I think that is definitely where the Queen sort of fell in love with Windsor Castle, which is still supposedly to be her favourite official home.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day. God save the King.
The whole family would make appearances on Buckingham Palace's balcony to join in the celebrations. The two princesses pleaded to join in the celebrations outside of the palace, and they were allowed to sneak out and take part. Years later, Elizabeth spoke of this time and said she wore her ATS uniform and pulled her hat over her face, hoping not to get spotted. She said, "We stood outside and shouted, 'We want the King.' I think it was one of the most memorable nights of my life." Before long, the two sisters embarked on a grand adventure with their mother and father. They set off on the first royal tour since the outbreak of World War II, and they made their way to South Africa. Here, Elizabeth celebrated her 21st birthday. She demonstrated her sense of duty and service, making a speech that would captivate her audience as she dedicated her life to the Commonwealth.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.
Both princesses were very keen equestrians, and during their spare time they visited Bonza Beach in South Africa and went horse riding. They enjoyed a brief moment of fun and freedom as they explored the area and spent some time just being sisters, laughing and joking around together. Elizabeth knew her role in life. She had to marry and have children, then one day become queen. She and Margaret both met Prince Philip when they were quite young, Elizabeth only 13 years old, and Philip 5 years her senior.
Her governess, Marion Crawford, talks in great detail about their first meeting at Dartmouth College, where Prince Philip was a naval cadet. And he was very, very good looking, 18 years old, very striking, blonde looking. And he was assigned to look after the two princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, for the day, for their visit, while their parents went around the college. But he decided that it would be fun if they jumped the tennis nets. So he took the princesses outside and he jumped the tennis nets for them, and they were very, very impressed.
He was at the beginning of his career with the Royal Navy at the time, and the war was about to start. But they would meet again, and when they did, romantic sparks would fly.
When her engagement to Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten of the Royal Navy is announced, the heart of the world is thrilled by the prospect of one royal wedding with a genuine aura of romance. A former Greek prince, Philip gave up his Greek citizenship to become a British subject. On the eve of the wedding, the king elevates him to the peerage, and he becomes officially His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich.
Well, when Elizabeth and Philip got engaged, they decided that because London was ravaged by war and a lot of the buildings were absolutely rubble, and there was unemployment, there was rationing, it was in a really bad place, the government or the king thought, well, let's have a very quiet wedding at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. No pomp, no ceremony, we'll just, be very private. But then the government, surprisingly, said, no, 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 we need to lift the people's spirits. Let's have a beautiful royal wedding that everybody can see.
And now the great hour arrives as the Queen and Princess Margaret Rose leave Buckingham Palace for the ceremony at Westminster Abbey. And Prince Philip, with split-second timing, also departs for the great rendezvous. The royal standard waves over a truly royal occasion as the state coach with Elizabeth and the King is escorted to Westminster Abbey by the household of cavalry guards, a sovereign's escort.
Elizabeth and Philip married, and Margaret was a bridesmaid. It was, of course, a very grand affair, and it lifted the spirits of the nation in the post-war austerity. The relationship between Elizabeth and her father was remarkably close, and he was saddened to lose Elizabeth to Philip. He wrote her a letter about the day, saying, "I was so proud and thrilled at having you so close to me on our long walk in Westminster Abbey. But when I handed your hand to the Archbishop, I felt I had lost something very precious."
In the great Abbey of Westminster, Elizabeth married the man of her choice. The ceremonial drive reflected her happiness. For had she not declared as a young girl, "When I get married, I shall make my husband as happy as Mummy has made Papa." Before leaving on their honeymoon, the young lovers made a picture that found a treasure in the album.
I think many people have asked the Queen and asked Prince Philip what is the secret of their relationship. And the Queen has spoken out on a few occasions. And she said, patience, sense of humour. And she said famously, of course, that Prince Philip had simply been her rock and her stay over the years. And he'd always been there to support her. Although he never involved himself in constitutional affairs, he was there as a sounding board. He was someone to listen and someone who would be on her side or would give her criticism, which of course nobody else really could.
The pieces of the puzzle were coming together for Elizabeth, and soon after her marriage, her focus changed to her duties and to her new family. She was very much focused on her husband and no longer on Princess Margaret, and that in itself would prove in time to be a cause of distress for the younger sister. Whilst they would remain close, Elizabeth now had a family of her own, and in 1948, Elizabeth's first child, Charles, was born.
The early years of marriage have set the seal on the happiness of the princess and her husband. The blessing of children has come not only to enrich their lives, but also to establish securely the line of succession. In Prince Charles, the public has acquired a new popular subject of interest, of whom some delightful pictures have been taken. We should like to see more of him, but the insatiable demand of the public has had to bow to the princess's very proper determination that her son shall not be spoilt by publicity.
For Margaret, it would be a different story, as her path was not as clearly predestined and defined. What would be her role? And how would she make a contribution to supporting her older sister, soon to be queen?
It was in Kenya, at the Royal Hunting Lodge, that the news of the king's death reached his daughter. When she returned from a night in the forest, it was to learn that she is now the queen, acceding to her father's throne immediately. There is no break in the continuity of the British monarchy. It was her own decision to return at once to London.
To both the girls, this was a day that would be truly devastating. They lost their father, King George VI, and although he had some health issues, it was somewhat unexpected as he was still relatively young.
The rulers of our land meet to welcome the new queen. There too, the Duke of Gloucester, her uncle, and the Lord Chancellor. The Premier and Mr. Attlee, leader of the opposition, are agreed in this great moment of our history. Her tour of the Commonwealth cancelled. The princess we knew as a girl and watched in the even growth of her stature comes back to meet her ministers as queen over the great lands that for 15 years acknowledged her father as head.
Princess Margaret had been very close to her father. King George VI is known to have said, "Lilibet is my pride, Margaret my joy." He had adored her. As a young child, she was known to be stubborn and demanding, and her father would indulge her every whim, perhaps because he knew he could never give her what he could give Elizabeth, the status and power of being queen. Margaret already felt a degree of separation from Elizabeth, so to lose the adoring love from her father left her somewhat out of sorts. Following his death, her smoking habit became a serious addiction, which was an unusual habit for members of the royal family other than her father, but something she became very well known for. The grief and loss was seriously affecting her, and soon she would seek out some kind of replacement. For Princess Elizabeth, though also in grief, his death came with an even more significant burden. She was described as remarkably stoic upon hearing the news whilst on tour in Africa. She thought she would have more time to prepare for the throne and learn from her father, but it was her duty to step up and follow in his place. It also cut short the one time in her life that she and Philip could be an almost ordinary family. The time they had spent in Malta whilst Philip was a serving naval officer was a tremendous period of normality for the young couple, but their life was going to change forever. For Elizabeth and Margaret, this would be the moment of the most significant shift in their relationship. Elizabeth takes complete control and authority. Margaret must play second fiddle. For someone born to shine in the way Margaret was, it must have felt like a great sacrifice and sadness.
Well, the historical significance of the coronation is that it's a very ancient ceremony, and the Queen has to be anointed in the eyes of God, and that is the coronation ceremony. She sits on the throne in a very simple white linen dress, and she has holy oil put on her forehead, and that makes her queen in the eyes of God, which is why she always said in all her speeches, you know, I will rule and I will do my duty, and as long as I'm fit and able to do so. And it was televised because Prince Philip pushed the idea that it would be a great thing for the country and the Commonwealth and the world even to have this ancient ceremony televised. Well, when the Queen came to the throne, she was only 26, and Churchill made the remark to his private secretary, but she's a child. But she wasn't a child. She was very sophisticated and mature mentally, and it was a man's world, and you know, women were really subservient in those days, and the Queen was walking into this world of men who were all much, much older than her. And also she hadn't really been taught. She said there was no way to be taught. All she did was she watched what her father did and followed him. So of course the court was very old-fashioned and very stuffy, you know, because it was really her father's court.
Queen Elizabeth's coronation was truly the event of the century. She was, by that time, filling her father's shoes, and Britain had grown an enormous amount of love and respect for her. She appeared dutiful and stoic, taking on her roles and responsibilities quite naturally. She was crowned queen on the 2nd of June 1953, and the event televised, even after pushback from Prime Minister of the time, Sir Winston Churchill. Though all eyes were on Elizabeth that day, Margaret garnered some attention as she accidentally revealed a new romantic interest in a very telling act of affection. She began brushing off some lint off the collar of a man called Group Captain Peter Townsend, thereby attracting the very keen attention of the press on what they perceived to be a very controversial relationship. Princess Margaret first met Peter Townsend when she was only 14 years old, and he was 16 years her senior. He served as equerry to her father, King George VI. He had the respect of those around him, being a real wartime hero, having shot down 11 German planes. Some 8 years later, after the death of Margaret's beloved father, she and Peter began their romance. Perhaps, when she was with Peter, she somehow felt closer to the father she lost. The equerry had known the king well, something of a comfort in the great loss she felt. The only real problem with Townsend was that he was recently divorced. With the very recent chaos caused by the abdication of King Edward VIII and his marriage to divorcee Wallis Simpson, it was very unlikely that they would be allowed to marry. Queen Elizabeth felt badly for her sister and desperately wanted Margaret to be with a man she loved, but it put her in a very challenging position. Elizabeth was head of the Church of England, which revoked the right of remarrying if the former spouse was living, which was the case for Peter Townsend. The palace courtiers conspired to get him out of the way, and he was sent to work for the air attaché for the British Embassy in Brussels whilst Margaret was away. She came back to find him gone, which left her completely devastated. Though Margaret understood the pressure Elizabeth was under, tension between the sisters was rising. Margaret wanted to have what Elizabeth had, a loving family complete with husband and child.
Excitement bubbles like champagne in London as Group Captain Peter Townsend returns from diplomatic duties in Belgium to call on Princess Margaret. Another, possibly a climactic phase, opens in the much-publicized royal romance that's had the Western world agog. The Queen and her family are watched with keenest attention for a hint of what the ultimate decision may be, yes or no, and what will the princess herself decide. All the world loves a lover, and there's nothing like a happy ending to a royal love story for national rapture. Britain watches with breathless anticipation an exciting week that reunites the sweethearts, brings the captain to dinner at the palace, and closets the royal family with the Archbishop of Canterbury, main opponent of the marriage. Captain Townsend seems unruffled by the tension, but the consensus is something definite had better happen soon, or an overwrought nation may just give way.
However, they figured out a way to overcome the rules. Once Margaret reached the age of 25, she could petition the Privy Council, and they could allow her to marry and keep her royal title and allowance without the need for permission from the Queen. She would be allowed to continue life as a royal, living in Britain, and continue public duties. It all looked as though it would go ahead as planned, but there was one small catch. Margaret would have to give up her succession rights, both for herself and for any children she may have.
To say, as has been said, that the Queen prevented them from marrying. She didn't at all. The Queen stood back and she said to Princess Margaret, "This is a decision that you are going to have to make." And the Queen did not want to influence and did not influence her sister in any shape or form. Her attitude was, "I can't do anything. You have to decide what you want to do."
I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others.
As her 25th birthday approached, she announced that she would not marry Townsend. Perhaps her decision to put duty before anything else takes inspiration from her sister. But she was said to be heartbroken at the time. It was a difficult decision, and one which would play on her mind for the rest of her life.
The late King's daughter became England's second Queen Elizabeth. Carefully reared to her responsibilities, she has already captured the affections of Britons during her short reign.
Whilst Margaret was trying to find a suitable husband, the Queen found herself in the midst of transforming the British Empire. It had been changing its shape over the previous decades, and more countries were gaining their independence. Many of these countries wanted the freedom of being independent, but also wanted to keep some of the beneficial ties, including trading and foreign affairs. By the late 1960s, most of the British territories became independent, but had joined the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth Elizabeth had dedicated her life to at the tender age of 21.
As the Royal Yacht Gothic steams slowly up the 12-mile Derwent estuary with the Queen and Duke on the observation bridge to catch the fullest view of the approach to Hobart. Small boats are out to welcome them as Gothic and her Navy escort move towards Prince's Wharf. It's a glorious sunny day, and the royal couple are out early. Both have said they wish to see as much of Australia as they can, and they're certainly missing no opportunity. Yachts line the sides of the Derwent as the royal yacht eases towards her berth. The city's population has swollen to almost double, and there are rousing cheers as Gothic comes alongside. And now Her Majesty is coming ashore, the Duke in Admiral's uniform descending the long gangway behind her. Another stage of the royal visit has begun. The Governor of Tasmania waits at the foot of the gangway to welcome the royal couple to Tasmanian soil.
It was a time of great transition, and the respect and trust for Her Majesty the Queen and her late father helped to keep the Commonwealth on track. It remains one of the gems of Elizabeth's reign. Her early vision of the Commonwealth was an entirely new conception, built on the highest qualities of the spirit of man, friendship, loyalty, and the desire for freedom and peace. Her vision had no doubt been successful. Even through years of political unease, it remains a remarkable force for change. Elizabeth spent much of her time away, visiting various countries within the Commonwealth, strengthening key relationships, and fulfilling her role to unite the nations.
This is a Royal Command performance. Children of Tasmania parade before their Queen, who too lives in a small island. Her thoughts are undoubtedly now with her own children.
Though Margaret was busy with her own engagements, the physical distance between the sisters would inevitably have an impact on the closeness they had with each other. In 1958, Margaret met Anthony Armstrong Jones. But it wasn't love at first sight. It took many months for romance to begin to grow, after Tony was commissioned to take photographs of Margaret. At the time, Princess Margaret was one of the most eligible women around, and she would have many parties to which she would invite Tony too. Still, many other eligible men were also in attendance, so the press did not pick up on their blossoming romance. They kept it all extremely quiet. However, Tony proposed to Margaret in February of 1960, and the public was very excited at the prospect of a royal wedding. As Tony had no prior history of marriage, to the delight of the Queen, she could give her approval for the marriage.
Wedding day rehearsal of Princess Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones with lots of excitement in Britain. Public attention is focused on last-minute preparations for the procession of the wedding couple from Westminster Abbey to Buckingham Palace.
Because nobody knew that she and Tony Armstrong Jones were seeing one another, when their engagement was announced, it really was a massive surprise. You know, the media was reeling, partly through enthusiasm and excitement. Like, who is this man? He's a photographer. He's one of us. You know, he worked in Fleet Street. He was a fashion designer, a fashion photographer, a society photographer. He was part of the press, you know, and they didn't know they had no idea that he even knew Princess Margaret. So there was this immense surprise.
In May 1960, Prince Philip accompanied Margaret down the aisle in place of her late father, a gesture that shows the fondness Margaret must have had for her sister's husband. It was the first royal wedding to be broadcast on television and was estimated to have 300 million viewers.
She said to me that Prince Philip kept coming into her room and saying, "If you don't hurry up, we're going to be late." As though her being the bride, it mattered whether or not she was going to be late. And she also, part of the fashion correspondence picked up, was that she wore a hairpiece curled as a chignon inside the Baltimore tiara that she was wearing. She said, "We'd rather hoping that was going to stay on."
Margaret and Tony would have 2 children. David was born in November 1961 and Sarah in May 1964. They led a fascinating life, full of glamour and parties and lots of exciting and important people. But it couldn't last forever, as they allegedly indulged in too much alcohol and recreational drugs. It caused a strain on their marriage. It didn't take long before the press speculated that something was wrong. Tony and Margaret would, however, cause a great deal of controversy with the British people during the tour of the US. In 1965, they travelled around America, meeting with politicians, as well as the Hollywood elite. Quite famously, during their visit to the White House, Princess Margaret would dance with President Johnson, which was said to be very well received, but the visit was seen as scandalous by British people, costing over £30,000. She was banned from visiting again for any official trip for many years to come. In 1960, Margaret was gifted some land on a small island in the Caribbean called Mustique. She built a beautiful home there and would regularly visit for some sense of privacy, and whilst her sister was away on tours. The wheels were falling off her marriage, and both she and Tony began to have affairs. It was the affair with the landscape gardener Roddy Llewellyn that the press first discovered. 5 months after they had met, Margaret invited him to stay with her in Mustique, and their relationship continued for quite some time. Meanwhile, Tony was having an affair with Lucy Lindsay Hogg, but both maintained to the outside world that they were still in a happy relationship. In 1976, Margaret's affair was made public after the Sunday newspapers obtained photographs of the princess and her lover in Mustique. The Queen was said to be most unimpressed, and they agreed to announce a separation immediately. In 1978, they divorced, and Princess Margaret became the first senior member of the royal family to divorce in 400 years. Most families' paths meet and separate throughout their lives, with circumstances sometimes forcing them apart, yet it is so often tragedy or crisis which brings them together again. Elizabeth was very supportive during the divorce. Margaret's children would often stay at her sister's to make things as easy as possible for Margaret. Margaret and Roddy remained close for some time, but he grew bored and moved his attentions to Tatiana Soskin, and she is said to have been very accepting and gave them her blessing. She was known for putting on a brave face, but it must have been a great shame for the princess to lose that kind of love from her life. They did remain good friends and would often come round to dine with the princess. The Queen and Roddy never really spent any time together, and the affairs created many problems for her. Still, upon Margaret's death, the Queen is said to have admitted to Lady Anne Glenconner, who introduced them, that she was pleased she introduced the two of them, and that Margaret could have that kind of love in her life. Margaret gained back the respect of the public in her charitable work, being patron or president of more than 80 organisations. She focused on activities and well-being of young people and caring for sick people. In the arts, she loved music and ballet and became the first president of the Royal Ballet, with the Queen serving as patron. In 1992, the Queen would go through what she would refer to as her annus horribilis. It would be a year that would cause her a great deal of stress and strain, as her son, Princess Andrew, would separate from his wife, Sarah. Her daughter, Princess Anne, would divorce from Captain Mark Phillips. Diana, Princess of Wales, publicly revealed the problems with her marriage to Prince Charles, and they would also separate. And to cap it all, Windsor Castle caught on fire. Princess Margaret was extremely supportive to the Queen, helping her through what was an extraordinarily tough year in Elizabeth's life. Princess Margaret had been having some significant health problems, many with similarities to those of her father, King George. She had surgery to remove part of her lung, just like the King. Princess Margaret died on the 9th of February 2002. To the Queen, this was a devastating loss.
I know the whole country will be deeply saddened by Princess Margaret's death. She will be remembered with a lot of affection. Before she was ill, in the last few years, she gave a great deal of service to the country, and our thoughts are obviously with the Queen Mother, and with all the royal family at this difficult time.
A month later, the Queen Mother would die, and Elizabeth gave a personal video message of her appreciation for the public mourning and love for the Queen Mother. It is said that the Queen was relieved not to have had to do the same when her sister had died, as she felt she may lose her composure. Quite unusually, on the day of Margaret's funeral, the Queen would be seen to wipe a tear from her eye. It is not often the Queen loses her composure, and indicates the level of love and affection she felt for her sister.
The Queen was very, very close to her mother and her sister. So for both of them to pass away within 2 months of each other was, a sort of double shock for her. She was still, full of grief.
Elizabeth and Margaret had a complex relationship, as most sisters do. They would disagree often and have different ideas about what the monarchy needed to look like and how they should behave. But every step of the way, Princess Margaret remained fiercely loyal to the Queen and was immensely proud of what she had achieved. And the Queen wanted nothing more than her sister to have a happy and fulfilling life. Many years ago, their father said with deep affection, "Lilibet is my pride and Margaret is my joy." Had he lived to see their relationship evolve, his feelings would only grow because of the extraordinary women they both became and the remarkable lives they led. And through everything, the closeness they kept as sisters.